Mark 14 starts out by saying it was now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. For they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people." This sets the stage for the story that we are about to read and Judas's reaction to what happens and the ultimate betrayal of Jesus. The chief priests have not liked Jesus for a long time because he went against their interpretation of the law and because they were jealous of his following. They were looking for an opportunity to kill Jesus, and Judas is about to help them by betraying his teacher, Jesus. Before we get to that, let's look at what happens just before Judas betrays him with a story of a woman who anointed Jesus' feet. Mark 14, starting in verse 3. And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, "Why was this ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. You always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." The disciples, specifically Judas, according to John's account, judged this woman for anointing Jesus with oil. They felt like the better thing to do here was to sell this rather expensive oil for money to help the poor. Of course, the main disciple pushing for this turns out to be the keeper of the change purse, who tended to dip into it and take money from it, as John tells us in his gospel. So he was not so much concerned about the poor as he was claiming. Jesus let them know that they had misjudged the situation. Although there are times to focus on the poor, this was not a time to do so. She had done the right thing by helping prepare Jesus for his death and burial. Jesus was about to go to the cross and die for the sins of the world, and Mary had begun the process of preparing Jesus for this sacrifice. This was a symbolic event that Jesus states would be told in memory of her. There is a time for everything according to Ecclesiastes, and we need to realize that in our day that sometimes certain actions have their time and place. This also means that we need to not assume that everything has to be done like we think it should be done. Yes, selling the oil and giving the proceeds to help the poor would have been a good work, but the anointing of Jesus was an even more important one at that time. Maybe right now something different needs to happen than what you think is the best option. Be open to that idea. Every season has a different focus, and so it goes for life, for churches, and for communities. It is important for us to evaluate situations before deciding the best option. One answer does not always fit in every circumstance. And when someone decides to take an action that we don't personally think is best, we ought to at least consider the possibility that they have an insight that we don't have, rather than immediately judge like the disciples did here. As we consider things from various angles, we may notice that there is more to what they are doing that really does make it a good or even the best action in the moment. Too often we are too impulsive and we jump to the wrong conclusions. We ought to be slow to speak and think thoroughly first before we just assume that we know best and others are making a mistake or doing things the wrong way. If after giving something a good degree of thought and examining various angles, it still seems wrong or not the best action, then is the time to open lines of discussion. Now let's continue reading Mark 14, verses 10 through 11, to see what happens next. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money, and he sought an opportunity to betray him. We're not sure why Judas betrayed Jesus. Some have insinuated that he was trying to push Jesus into fulfilling his idea of the purpose of the Messiah. The timing of Judas going to the chief priest seems like part of the reason may have been related to Jesus going against his saying that the ointment should have been sold. As John's gospel points out, Judas had selfish motivations for the ointment being sold because he would pilfer from the money bag. So when Jesus did not go along with what Judas wanted here, it could have provided some final motivation for him to betray Jesus. Ultimately, we cannot know exactly why Judas betrayed Jesus, but selfishness seems to be at least part of the equation, though he later shows regret and tries to return the blood money for which he betrayed Jesus. We need to examine our motivations for doing things to make sure they are pure. Mary's motivation for anointing Jesus' feet were pure and motivated by love for Jesus. Judas's earthly desires eventually led him to betray his friend, his teacher, and his God. We need to be careful that our desires do not lead us down the wrong path into doing that which is evil. And a great place to start is by examining our motives for our actions and striving to have pure motives. And as we see selfishness or pride creeping in, then we need to adjust our attitudes and our actions to keep ourselves away from the temptation to do wrong. As always, I hope you have gained something from today's message. I encourage you to always strive to be aware of your motivations for doing things and to seek not only to do the right things for the right reasons, but to seek to do the best things when there are multiple good options. And be careful not to judge others too hastily. I hope you have a great week and may God bless you as you seek to follow him.